Sound Minds Radio, getting you behind the research and ideas in contemporary life. This episode produced by Dallas Rogers. Sound Minds Radio, part of the Community Radio Network. soundminds.com.au.
The other day I was talking to Shanthi Robinson about her migration research. You know, about how people move across borders and travel between countries.
I'm Shanthi Robinson and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney University.
And about halfway through our discussion, Shanthi hit me with a fairly heavy idea.
I think the mandatory detention of people who have committed no crime, their indefinite detention, the ongoing effects of being incarcerated and having absolutely no idea when you might even have the possibility of getting out. We don't even do that to prisoners who've committed horrific crimes. We at least tell mass murderers, you're going to be here forever, or you're going to be here for 20 years. And it will be looked back on as a very dark and inhumane period of Australia's history. I think for this generation's children and grandchildren, it will be looked back upon like the stolen generation, like the genocide of Indigenous people, as a complete violation of human rights and a really dark period of Australia's history.
Now, I just want to let you contemplate that for a minute. The idea that Australia's immigration and detention regimes have become so punitive that future generations will look back on our inaction and say,
"Why didn't you do anything about it?"
I just couldn't shake this idea. In fact, it travelled home with me. And it even came back to haunt me later that night when I was watching the ABC's Q&A show.
Now, our next question is on a different subject, comes from Chris Hagan.
I think we'll look back on the offshore detention of refugees with the same level of horror and disdain as we do now with previous governments' abuse of human rights with stolen generations.
Now, these are big claims, and migration and globalization scholars take them really seriously. And they start by rethinking an idea that's at the heart of Australian migration and globalisation debates.
Let's begin by saying that we live in a country called Australia. And my starting point really is to not taking Australia for granted, that has very fixed borders and a very fixed identity.
That's Ian Ung.
I am In Ang. I am a professor of cultural studies at the Institute for Culture and Society, Western Sydney University. Of course, all countries are part of a larger world, and there are flows between countries which make our borders in cultural terms and social terms quite porous rather than fixed.
Ian and Shanthi ask us to think about the physical and cultural borders, and even the spaces between countries, in a different way.
Effectively, migration is moving from one place to another. It's a spatial movement, it's crossing a border. So a lot of migration studies has looked at the impact on space of migration. So how, cultures and places change because of new people coming in, and also how cultures and places change when people leave and when people move back and forth. So that's been a really big focus. But also, I guess, space, not necessarily as something tangible, but as something that's imagined. So where people imagine they belong, how people imagine their homelands, for example, and the places that they belong to, but also kind of spatial concepts like the border, which is both a tangible, physical manifestation of place, but it's also something that we all kind of collectively imagine for specific sorts of political and social ends. And migrants obviously are these subjects that cross the border, so they make us think really seriously about borders, not just a national border between different nation states, although obviously that's really important, but borders around who belongs and who doesn't belong, borders around what we want our kinds of national cultures and our urban cultures to look like. So that idea of the border, I guess, has been quite important to migration studies.
Wait gentlemen, we have just landed Beijing Capital International Airport, Terminal 3. The temperature is 21 degrees Celsius or 7.
So Australia's always been a part of Asia, at least geographically. So the interesting changes in our relationship with Asia are not geographical or physical, but cultural.
That's the interesting thing, that geography is a factual thing, but how people feel about geography is a cultural thing, right? So a lot of Australians might know that Asia is actually geographically very close, but they feel quite distant towards it. So there is an important American political scientist. He came up with the term distant proximity.
Ian's being modest. She's written about this too.
So I think that's an interesting term. So like Australia and Asia, that relationship is characterized by a sense of distant proximity. So you are actually close in terms of geography, but far away in terms of feelings and sense of affinity and so forth.
So different cultures of migration inform how and why people choose to migrate. And cultural understandings of migration interact with government policy in some pretty interesting ways.
They're really closely related, I think, asylum policy and voluntary migration policy. So again, it's that discursive construction of who is a desirable migrant economically and who's an undesirable migrant economically. And often refugees get put in the second category. So it's hard to say cause and effect when you're talking about cultures of migration, people's desires and decisions about how they move, and policy. The two continually inform each other and interplay with each other, I think. So in some ways that circularity is a result of policy, but in some ways the circularity also feeds back into policy. So, we had this nation-building approach in the post-war era, right? So our immigration minister, Arthur Caldwell, famously said, I think in about 1945, that we had to populate or perish. So it really was a nation-building and a permanent settler kind of paradigm.
The change started 1960s, 1970s, when migration policy opened up for non-white people. So that was the end of the White Australia policy. Since then, more and more migrants coming into Australia are from Asia. And that has actually really changed, for example, the composition of the big cities in terms of population. What is also changing very rapidly is the business links between Australia and many different Asian countries. Lots of Asian tourists come to Australia. And as also, on the other side, Australians also become more familiar with Asian countries as tourist countries and increasingly also as countries where people work. So there are quite a lot of Australian expats, for example, in places like Hong Kong and Singapore. So there is that interconnection that takes place through flows of people, but also flows of money, flows of ideas and so forth. So because of that, I think Asia is becoming closer to Australia, not just geographically, but also in terms of culture. And as you know, Australia's relationship with Asia has been on the political agenda for some time. It's not a new issue.
And earlier I spoke to Jenny McGregor, the head of AsiaLink, a centre promoting the importance of Asian countries in Australia, and I asked her about her views on the paper.
That's the 2012 Australia in the Asian Century White Paper.
What are the key commitments from your perspective?
The key thing that we were concerned about was how capable is our community, how Asia capable are we, from our students in schools to our directors of boards.
So rather than looking at migration in very rigid nation-state terms, with hard legal and physical borders that are regulated and controlled by government policy, we need to also look at the relationships between countries, to understand how the flow of people and money and skills and labour might be shaping Australia.
What we're seeing now with neoliberalisation is migration much more being about flexible labour and an approach to migration that's based on people's capital. So it's a very hierarchical selection process, and we try to quantify migrants based on what we think their economic value is going to be to the nation state. It's also about people's value as consumers and investors. So that's why we see things like the high significance to the Australian economy of student visas and also investor visas as well. And alongside that, we've seen a reduction in the number of migrants we take through categories that we just don't see, or the government doesn't see as adding economic value. So there's been a pretty drastic reduction in humanitarian entrants and also family visas.
The resettled migrants say they're keen to help boost the economy as Australia prepares to take in large numbers of refugees from Syria and Iraq. A new report shows migrants hold significant potential to boost the small business sector if given the right assistance.
There's also been a move here to what is referred to as a demand-based rather than a supply-based immigration system. So even when we instigated skilled migration and a points test, it used to be about a migrant meeting the criteria via the points test and then being granted a visa, usually a permanent visa. Now it's much more about migrants needing to be sponsored either by a state government or by an employer because they meet very specific short-term labour demand. They've got a particular set of skills, qualifications or occupation that's relevant to the labour market at this particular point in time. So there's the temporal element there too, that a demand-driven migration program is in essence responding to short-term demands, not to a long-term temporal horizon of nation building.
So the world is shifting towards Asia, and the cultural narratives about Australia and Asia are changing too.
I do think that Australia is in an interesting spot in that respect. I think the importance of Asia, and especially we have to think here of not Asia in general. China, I think, is the most important country in Asia and the most powerful country economically, but therefore also increasingly politically. And countries like the United States and certainly European countries, they realize this, and they are now much more aware of the importance of establishing good relations with China and the rest of Asia. But in terms of migration, for example, I think Australia is in that sense quite further ahead, because the percentage of Asian migrants in Australia, it's about 8%, I think, of the population, is much higher than, for example, in the US, which is 4%, and places like the UK, only 2%. So in that sense, Australia is becoming much more Asian in itself.
And it's hard to measure the opportunities that these changing intercultural relationships might afford.
It's quite hard to measure these things long term. So that sort of classical 20th century story of migrant success, starting from nothing, working your way up, and the broader social changes, I think that shows a longer term view of migration, which I think is sort of dropping out a little bit in current policy frameworks, because the current policy understanding is we need oil and gas engineers in this particular region in Northwest Australia now because we're having a mining boom. So we need people with those very specific skills for a short period of time in this one specific area. And the longer term sort of benefits maybe get are missed in that sort of narrative of migration.
In fact, Ian has just published a report that looks towards building the cultural skills we might need to unlock the long-term benefits.
Establishing some evidence-based findings about what needs to be done for Australia to become a more integrated part of the Asian region. Economically, Asia is becoming more and more important for Australia. So even though historically Australia was much more focused on Europe and the United States, in this coming century, Australia's relationship with Asia is going to be much more important for prosperity and security.
You've been listening to another episode from Sound Minds Radio, produced for the Community Radio Network. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, or visit our website, soundminds.com.au.